When it comes to technological achievements and national prestige, few feats can compare to launching a satellite into space. Since the Soviet Union launched the world's first satellite, Sputnik I, on October 4th, 1957, 11 other government bodies have developed indigenous orbital launch capability. The United States, France, Japan, China, India, Israel, Ukraine, Iran, North Korea, South Korea, and a group of 22 nations represented by the European Space Agency. Conspicuously absent from the list is the United Kingdom, which in the late 1960s succeeded in developing this capability only to immediately abandon it. This is the story of the tragically brief British space program. At the end of the Second World War, Britain was well positioned to start its own advanced rocketry program. Like the United States and the Soviet Union, the victorious ally had captured dozens of German V-2 rockets, which had rained down on southern England and Belgium at the end of the war, along with capturing many of the scientists and technicians who had built and fired them in the first place. And so it was that in October of 1945, the British Army launched Operation Backfire, in which 3 captured V-2s were assembled, launched, and filmed near Cuxhaven in northern Germany. These experiments gave the British a wealth of knowledge and experience on the workings of the German terror weapon. 1 year later, on December 23, 1946, R.A. Smith and H.E. Ross of the British Interplanetary Society submitted to the Ministry of Supply a design for a modified V-2 that could carry a man into space. Their concept replaced the rocket's 1-ton explosive warhead with a pressurized capsule that would detach at apogee and parachute to the Earth. Unfortunately, Britain, shattered both physically and financially by the war, could not afford to fund such a project, and all plans for military and civilian rocketry were quietly shelved. But all this would soon change thanks to 2 significant world events. The first was the passing of the Atomic Energy Act by U.S. President Harry S. Truman on August 1, 1946. Though British scientists had contributed greatly to the Manhattan Project, and the British government had assumed that its special relationship would keep nuclear research flowing between the two countries, the 1946 Act prohibited the United States from sharing atomic secrets with any foreign nation, even wartime allies like Britain and Canada. The second event came on August 29, 1949, when the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, shattering the U.S. nuclear monopoly and shifting the Cold War into a dangerous new phase. Now facing a nuclear-armed enemy mere hours away and cut off from the U.S. nuclear research, Britain embarked on a crashed nuclear program of its own, culminating in the detonation of its first atomic bomb, codenamed Hurricane, off the Montebello Islands in northwest Australia on October 2, 1952. But while Britain was now a nuclear-armed nation, it still chose not to pursue large-scale military rocketry, instead basing its nuclear deterrent on gravity bombs dropped from a trio of manned jet aircraft dubbed the V-bombers. The Handley Page Victor, the Vickers Valiant, and the Avro Vulcan. But by the time these aircraft entered service, they had already been rendered all but useless by advancements in Soviet aerial defenses. So in April of 1954, the UK and the US signed an agreement to cooperatively develop a pair of ballistic missiles to serve as a viable deterrent against Soviet nuclear attack. The American design, the AM-65 Atlas, would be an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, with a range of 9,300 kilometers, while the British design would be a medium-range ballistic missile, or IRBM, with a range of 3,700 kilometers. In accordance with the post-war British system of rainbow codes, the latter was dubbed Blue Streak. Designed and built by de Havilland Propellers of Lostock, Lancashire, Blue Steel stood 24 meters tall, weighed 90 tons, fully loaded, and was fueled by kerosene and liquid oxygen. Like the Atlas missile it was based on, Blue Streak featured balloon-style propellant tanks made of thin stainless steel, which were kept rigid by the pressure of the propellant inside them. This greatly reduced the rocket's weight, allowing it to loft its projected 3-megaton thermonuclear warhead all the way to Moscow. The first static test firings of Blue Streak rocket engines and complete missile took place in 1955 and 1956 at the newly built Intermediate Range Ballistic Missile Test Center at RAF Spade Adam in Cumbria and at the Needles Battery on the Isle of Wight. Meanwhile, a separate test program, codenamed Project Dazzle, was underway in Australia to develop the missile's warhead. As designed, Blue Streak would climb up to an altitude of 250 kilometers beyond the edge of space, whereupon the warhead would detach and plunge back through the atmosphere. This would expose the warhead to the tremendous heat of re-entry, potentially causing it to burn up. Thus, to help determine the ideal shape and construction of the warhead, in 1955, aerospace manufacturer Saunders Roe Limited began work on a small research rocket codenamed Black Knight. Standing 12 meters high and fueled by a combination of kerosene and high-test hydrogen peroxide, topside, or HTP, Black Knight was designed to carry a miniature warhead nose cone to an altitude of 225 kilometers and release it, allowing observers on the ground to track its re-entry through the atmosphere. Later versions were built with a powered second stage that could propel the nose cone earthwards at speeds of up to 18,000 kilometers per hour. As nowhere in the British Isles had the space needed for full-scale rocket testing, Black Knight launches were conducted at the Woomera Rocket Range in South Australia, established in 1947 as a joint test site for Anglo-Australian weapons. The first launch took place on September 7, 1958, achieving a then world record altitude of 564 kilometers. A further 22 launches would take place over the next 7 years, the rocket proving so reliable and cost-effective that it continued to be used as a high-altitude research vehicle even after Project Dazzle had ended. The first full-scale launches of the Blue Streak missile were scheduled for 1960, but on April 13th of that year, Defense Minister Harold Watkinson announced the cancellation of the project. While the unexpected cancellation confused the British public and angered the aerospace industry that had worked for over 6 years to develop the missile, there was a cold logic to the decision. For one thing, the project was grossly expensive, its cost ballooning from an estimated £50 million in 1955 to nearly $300 million by 1959. But more importantly, Blue Streak would likely have been useless as a nuclear deterrent. You see, liquid oxygen cannot be stored for long periods without boiling off, meaning that the missile had to be fueled immediately before launch. But this process took up to 4.5 minutes, longer than the maximum warning time Britain would have had of an incoming Soviet attack, making Blue Streak highly vulnerable to the first strike. De Havilland tried to mitigate this problem by creating a system whereby missiles could be fueled and kept on standby for up to 10 hours. In this case, all the missiles in a battery would be fueled and readied in rotation, meaning at least one was available for immediate launch. However, this system relied on a period of rising international tensions to allow the first missiles to be readied, and was therefore useless against a surprise attack. Another system developed to protect Blue Streak against a preemptive strike was the hardened underground missile silo, a British invention later exported to the United States. However, construction of the first silos at RAF Spadeadam was still underway when Blue Streak was cancelled outright. In its place, Britain adopted the American air-launched Douglas GAM-87 Skybolt missile, which promised to revitalize the V-bomber force by allowing it to launch nuclear strikes from beyond the range of Soviet air defenses. Unfortunately, the Skybolt was plagued by technical problems that prevented its adoption by the Royal Air Force, leaving Britain without a viable nuclear deterrent and sparking a diplomatic crisis between the UK and the United States. The so-called Skybolt crisis was only resolved in 1962 when the US agreed to sell Britain UGM-27 Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Able to travel undetected and strike without warning, Polaris submarines proved a far superior deterrent to the V-bomber force, or Blue Streak. Indeed, today the Royal Navy's 4 Vanguard-class submarines, each armed with 16 newer Trident II missiles, constitute the entirety of the UK's nuclear arsenal. Meanwhile, on April 26, 1962, Britain succeeded in launching its first satellite, Ariel 1, though not aboard a British rocket, but rather the American Thor Delta rocket. While an impressive achievement, the mission was short-lived, as barely 2 months later, Ariel 1 was severely damaged by the American Starfish Prime high-altitude nuclear test. See our video that time the US accidentally nuked Britain's first satellite. In any event, still keen on developing indigenous launch capability, as well as deflect criticism for cancelling Blue Streak, the British government proposed repurposing the missile as the first stage of a civilian satellite launcher. One early proposal by the Royal Aircraft Establishment, codenamed Black Prince, used Blue Streak as its first stage, a modified Black Knight as the second, and a military solid-fueled rocket motor as the third. However, the projected £62 million price tag was too high for Britain to bear alone, so the government sought out partners to help fund the project. However, Commonwealth nations like Canada and Australia were uninterested, so Britain turned instead to a group of European nations who, in 1964, joined together to form the European Launcher Development Organization, or ELDO. The goal of ELDO was to develop a 3-stage launch vehicle called Europa, capable of placing a 1,000-kilogram satellite into a 500-kilometer orbit, with each stage being designed and built by a different nation. The British Blue Streak would form the first stage, the French Coralie the second, and the West German Astris the third. In addition, Italy would supply the first ELDO satellite, the Netherlands and Belgium the tracking and telemetry systems, and Australia, an associated member, the launch site at Woomera. The first full-scale test of Blue Streak, now the Europa first stage, took place at Woomera on June 5, 1964. The launch and ascent went smoothly, but propellant sloshing in the tanks led to uncontrollable vibrations at the 140-second mark, causing the rocket to disintegrate. A further 4 successful and 6 unsuccessful launches were conducted at Woomera before the project was moved at the French launch site of Kourou, French Guiana in South America. Here, the first test launches of all 3 Europa stages were conducted on November 5, 1971. While all 3 stages worked perfectly, after 3 minutes, a rogue electrostatic discharge caused the guidance system to erroneously report that the rocket was veering off course, prompting the range safety officer to initiate a self-destruct. In the wake of this failure, Eldo abandoned the Europa design and Britain left the group. In 1975, the group merged with the European Space Research Organization to form the European Space Agency, which on December 24, 1973, successfully launched the first of the highly successful Ariane family of launch vehicles, versions of which are still in use to this day. Following its withdrawal from Eldo, Britain's prospects of becoming an independent spacefaring nation appeared bleak. However, in 1964, engineers at Saunders Roe had submitted a proposal for a small satellite launcher based on the hydrogen peroxide technology developed for the Black Knight research rocket. Dubbed Black Arrow, the compact 3-meter rocket used kerosene peroxide motors for its first and second stages and a waxwing solid motor for the third, allowing it to loft a 100-kilogram payload into low Earth orbit. Furthermore, the second stage was deliberately made the same diameter as the Europa's Coralie second stage, allowing Black Arrow to use Blue Streak as the first stage for even greater performance. Indeed, while the blueprints specified most dimensions in imperial units, the first stage diameter was given in metric units to maintain compatibility with the European rocket. Believing they could now achieve independent launch capability before Europa, Britain withdrew from Eldo and focused its efforts on Black Arrow. However, it remained committed to supplying 2 Blue Streak first stages to Eldo until 1976. The first Black Arrows were shipped to the Woomera rocket range in early 1969. Due to its stubby shape and red high-visibility paint used on the payload fairing, the diminutive vehicle became affectionately known as the Lipstick Rocket. The first suborbital test launch, designated RO, took place on June 28, 1969, with dummy second and third stages attached. Almost immediately, an electrical fault in the engine gimbaling system caused the rocket to roll erratically and break up, the remains being blown up by the range safety officer. The second launch, R1, conducted on March 4, 1970, was more successful, reaching an altitude of 550 kilometers. The first full-up orbital test of Black Arrow, R2, took place on September 2, 1970, with the rocket carrying Orba, a simple satellite designed to measure the density of the upper atmosphere. Unfortunately, however, the second stage shut down 13 seconds early, and the rocket and its payload failed to reach orbit. Even worse, on July 29, 1971, Frederick Corfield, Minister of State for Trade and Industry, announced the cancellation of the Black Arrow program. Once again, the decision was purely a practical one. Without a more powerful first stage, Black Arrow could only place small satellites into low Earth orbit, making it of limited scientific and commercial value. It was also expensive, with the UK government determining that it was cheaper to use American-made Scout rockets. But Black Arrow would get one last chance to achieve glory, as the components of the fourth and final rocket, R3, had already been delivered to Woomera. When the cancellation was announced, permission was granted to proceed with the launch. As Roy Dommett, an engineer on the project, later recalled, there was pride in getting it away and making sure it worked, but there was also a lot of regret because the project had been canceled. People were upset, but although the project had been canceled, funding was still there for that year and the team were already in Australia. I think they decided just to go ahead with it. Australia was so far away, so it was almost out of sight, out of mind. Another engineer, Richard Tremaine Smith, remembered many of his colleagues being cautiously optimistic. There was a determination to get on and finish the job. It wasn't really thought of as being significant at the time. The feeling was, I am sure we will do something else. The ideas and the engineering were there, but everybody was squabbling over the pennies. To memorialize and perhaps subtly protest the cancellation, the engineers enacted a cheeky name change. R4's intended payload, a 66-kilogram spacecraft designed to study the effects of space environment on communication satellites, was originally dubbed Puck after the mischievous sprite from William Shakespeare's play A Midsummer Night's Dream. Following Black Arrow's cancellation, however, it was renamed Prospero after the sorcerer in The Tempest who gives up his magic powers. Prospero successfully reached orbit on October 28, 1971, becoming the first, and thus far only, satellite to be launched by a British-built rocket. Though Britain has built dozens of satellites since, all have been launched aboard other nations' rockets. The fourth Black Arrow built, R4, was never launched and now hangs in the Science Museum in London, a melancholy memorial for the only country to develop and then abandon its own satellite launchers.